Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are plunging into one of the most consequential days of the 20th century, pulling from this stack of sources to understand June 6th, 1944.
That's right. We're undertaking a deep dive into the Allied landings in Normandy, what everyone knows as D-Day. We're going to, follow the journey from those really intense planning sessions in Britain through the landings themselves and then into that whole complex summer campaign of 44 that, well, ultimately carved a path towards Berlin.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our sources, they make it clear pretty quickly. This wasn't just, a single military operation. It was an event of just staggering scale. We're talking about millions of men, incredibly complex layers of deception, really audacious engineering just to get ashore, and of course, the immense human cost on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's fascinating about the sources we have is they give you this multifaceted view. We'll look at it through the eyes of the big names, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Churchill, Rommel. But they also bring in the experiences of, the countless anonymous individuals who were there. We even get insights from the cameramen, like Sergeant Grant and Sergeant O'Neill, who are risking their lives right alongside the soldiers, filming it all.
It really brings it home, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So our mission for this deep dive, basically, is to grasp the sheer scale, the meticulous, sometimes kind of conflicting planning, the brutal challenges faced on that specific day, and the immediate aftermath of this absolutely pivotal moment in history.
Okay, so the core decision, the thing that really set all this in motion, that was made at the Tehran Conference, December 1943.
Right, the big three.
Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, agreeing to finally invade Western Europe. And our sources really highlight how Stalin had been pushing for this for 2 long years, demanding that second front to relieve the, unimaginable pressure on his forces in the East.
Yeah, and for a while, the Anglo-Americans, and Churchill had a lot of influence here, they'd favored a different strategy, hadn't they?
They had, going through North Africa, then up into Italy, sort of the soft underbelly idea. But that southern route, it kind of got bogged down near Naples. Didn't really deliver the knockout blow they hoped for. And you also had Roosevelt initially hesitating a bit, wondering if the U.S. was fully ready for something this massive. But by late 43, things had shifted. Roosevelt was really eager to end the war in the West quickly.
And saw this as the way.
Exactly, the direct assault. Plus, the sources point to his thinking about post-war cooperation with the Soviets. Churchill, he had to face the military and political reality. The cross-channel invasion, Operation Overlord, it was happening.
And here's a key thing our sources really emphasize: the outcome of the entire war. And you could argue the whole shape of the post-war world. It really hinged on this one decision.
Absolutely. And while the Allies were debating where and when, Hitler, according to these accounts, he'd actually been worried about a Western invasion since 1941. Yeah. And in 1942, he kicks off his big countermeasure, building the Atlantic Wall, this gigantic, almost mythical line of fortifications, supposedly stretching nearly 4,000 miles from Norway down to Spain.
4,000 miles. That's just, how do you even build that?
The scale was unbelievable. And despite this huge effort, the Germans mostly believed the Allies would hit Calais. It's the shortest crossing, right? Only 25 miles from Britain.
Makes sense.
The construction itself, it took 13 million tons of concrete. And the labor. Requisition workers, French forced labor, refugees, Jews, POWs, a huge, grim workforce. So by late 43, Fortress Europe looked pretty formidable on paper.
So, decision made, Germans digging in. The Allies needed their leader for this thing, and that's when Eisenhower shows up, January 44.
Exactly. Roosevelt picked him personally to lead overlords. Eisenhower gets to London, and the sources describe him as pretty confident, believing in the power of an aroused democracy to fight. Soon after, he introduces his core team.
And given to his joint command, his number 2 had to be British, right? Field Marshal Montgomery.
Monty, yeah. Hero of North Africa, very popular back home. And quite the personality. The sources mention he kind of sought out the limelight, even in those carefully staged photos, though they had to use a faded map for secrecy.
Right. So despite the Germans thinking Calais, and maybe some initial Allied thoughts that way too, the actual landing site chosen was Normandy. Why Normandy?
Crucially, the beaches. Even though it was further from Britain, the Normandy coastline was just less heavily defended than the Pas-de-Calais area. That was the calculation.
Less defended,
Okay.
but not undefended. The first plan was for a spring landing, quite narrow, between Ouistreham and Carentan. But Monty pushed for a change right away, didn't he?
He did, and our sources really highlight this. He argued really forcefully for widening the whole front line from the get-go, extending it east towards Kamian.
Why? What was the thinking?
His logic was strategic. A narrow beachhead, he figured, could get bottled up easily, pinned down. A wider one gave the armored divisions room to maneuver, to spread out inland, avoid massive traffic jams right on the beach. He also insisted on pushing west towards Cherbourg. Ah, the port.
Exactly. He knew they absolutely needed a deep water port, and quickly, for the sheer logistics of supplying this huge invasion force, you couldn't rely on just landing stuff over the beaches forever.
In all this planning, millions of details had to be kept completely secret. That's a huge theme in these accounts, the secrecy.
Paramount. Absolutely paramount. And the amazing thing is, the Germans were still genuinely unsure about the exact landing spot in early 44. The Allies played on that brilliantly with Operation Fortitude.
The deception plan?
Yeah, this incredibly elaborate campaign. Propaganda, fake radio traffic, disinformation, all designed to make the Germans certain the main attack was coming elsewhere, especially Calais.
And they went to incredible lengths, right? Like inflatable tanks.
Inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, phony airfields with rubber planes parked on them, all positioned across the channel from Calais. It's amazing stuff. Meanwhile, the real troops and mountains of supplies for Normandy were being hidden, camouflaged, all across southern England. So while the Allies are planning and deceiving, Hitler gets confirmation of his fears when Eisenhower arrives, and he turns to Rommel.
Right. Rommel, the Desert Fox, hugely popular. He'd been brought back in 42. Early 44, Hitler tasks him with beefing up Fortress Europe. So Rommel arrives in France, starts his inspections.
And Rommel's take, according to the sources, was that the real fight would be on the beaches themselves, and he thought they were, well, badly defended.
He did. He wasn't impressed initially. He wanted a continuous line of defense, not just strong points here and there. And he desperately wanted more mines along the coast. Millions more mines. But think about it, 750 miles of coastline just in his sector. Mining all of that was a massive ask in itself.
And there was that split in the German command, too, which caused problems. Hitler put von Rundstedt in overall charge in the west, but Rommel specifically in charge of coastal defense.
Yeah, and that split led to a really fundamental strategic argument, especially about the panzer divisions, the tanks. Von Rundstedt, the sort of old-school strategist, wanted to keep them back, inland, as a reserve, ready to counterattack after the Allies landed and showed their hand.
Okay. Makes sense in a way.
But Rommel totally disagreed. He believed Allied air power would be so dominant, so overwhelming, that any German attempt to move tanks inland after the landings would be suicidal. They'd be sitting ducks.
So he wanted them right up front.
Right near the coast, ready to hit the invaders the second they stepped onto the beach, smash them before they could get established.
But his view didn't win out.
No, Hitler and von Rundstedt overruled him. So Rommel, frustrated on the tank issue, poured all his energy into fortifying the beaches themselves with obstacles. Anti-tank barriers, those wicked-looking chevaux de frise made from old railway tracks, anti-landing craft poles with mines on top, and even flooding low-lying areas inland to screw up landings and paratroopers.
While Rommel's doing that, the Allies are innovating like mad back in Britain. Those artificial ports, the mulberries, our sources, really stress how important they were.
Oh, absolutely game-changing. It was a brilliant solution to a massive problem. How do you unload literally tons of supplies every day without capturing a major port right away? Because Cherbourg or Le Havre would be heavily defended, maybe demolished.
So they just built their own ports.
Basically, yeah. They built these enormous concrete caissons called phoenixes in Britain, towed them across the channel, sunk them in lines to create breakwaters, then added floating docks, roadways made of steel pontoons. It was like a giant floating Lego set, gave them instant harbors right off the invasion beaches, incredible flexibility.
And the training, just constant, relentless training all over Britain.
Had to be. They were testing everything, new tanks designed to clear mines, special matting to help vehicles cross soft sand, new jeeps being put through their paces on these crazy wavy roads they built, gymkhanas they called them, and those terrifying Churchill crocodile flame-throwing tanks.
Sounds intense.
Yeah.
But dangerous, too.
Very. These weren't just drills. Hundreds of Allied soldiers died in training accidents. They used areas like Cornwall because the terrain was rugged, a bit like Normandy, to make it realistic. Tragic, but seen as necessary.
And by early 44, Britain is just teeming with soldiers, especially Americans.
Absolutely swarming. Over 800,000 GIs were there by February of 44, and more arriving all the time. The sources talk about the cultural dynamics, some friction, some stereotypes. The Brits as the poor old blokes, the Americans as the spoiled cousins because they had better rations, more money.
I can imagine.
But also a lot of mixing, fraternization, places like Blackpool were packed, led to spikes in divorces, illegitimate kids. Just a really unique, high-pressure situation on the island.
Keeping morale up during that long wait must have been critical. Leadership.
Oh, Eisenhower got that completely. He visited places like Sandhurst, the British Military Academy, and really hammered home that leadership was about more than just tactics. He told young officers they had to be leaders, yes, but also like fathers, mentors, know every single man in your unit, that kind of thing.
Churchill got really involved too, didn't he? Showing up at exercises.
Yeah, he became totally committed to Overlord by this point. Attended training, especially with U.S. paratroopers. Great for morale, great for the newsreels, reinforcing that Allied unity.
And amidst all this, you had the cameramen, kind of the unsung heroes documenting it.
Working away, often unseen. Students from the British Army Film School, volunteers, young guys like Sergeant Desmond O'Neill, only 20. He felt his camera gave the tense soldiers something else to focus on for a moment. Or Sergeant Ian Grant, 27, maybe partly joined the film corps to avoid chores, as one source hints, but also saw the historic importance. Their job was vital. Capture the experience, the human story.
So as May turns into June, the final countdown begins. Things get really tense.
Yeah, the final stages. Hundreds of thousands of men moved into these sealed staging camps near the embarkation ports, cut off from the outside world to prevent leaks. Discipline was apparently relaxed a bit just to keep spirits up during that nerve-wracking wait.
And they even introduced new money.
New French francs, yeah, printed by the Allies. Caused a bit of a political row with General de Gaulle, who saw it as undermining French sovereignty. But for the soldiers, it was another sign things were getting real.
What was the mood like among the men then?
The sources describe this strange mood, a kind of quiet realization that many of them weren't coming back. A heavy atmosphere. Then, on May 31st, they finally get these little booklets telling them the target, Normandy.
Wow. After all that waiting and secrecy.
Yeah, extra rations handed out, final briefings in the companies. But even then, for most ordinary soldiers, the absolute final confirmation of the target came very, very late.
Then, early June, the move to the ports.
This absolutely colossal movement, hundreds of thousands of men leaving the camps, heading for 19 different ports along England's south coast, locals coming out to watch them go, wave them off. Broadly speaking, British troops in the east, Americans in the west, and the Canadians, the third biggest force, 21,000 of them, heading for their designated ships.
The logistics are just mind-boggling. 20,000 vehicles being reversed onto ships, thousands of tons of supplies loaded.
Everything had to be just right, and Eisenhower had these very specific conditions for H-hour. Needed a full moon for the paratroopers and pilots the night before, and a half-tide rising at dawn for the landing craft.
A narrow window.
Very narrow.
Yeah.
In June 44, only the 5th, 6th, or 7th worked. He initially picked June 5th, hoping for maximum surprise.
But the weather. The infamous D-Day weather.
Exactly. June 4th, just as the first ships are setting sail, this violent storm blows up in the channel. Ferocious winds, high seas.
Oh, no.
Eisenhower had to make that agonizing call. Bring them back. Recall the ships already at sea. Operation Overlord was hanging by a thread. Huge fear that all this movement, the recall, might have tipped off the Germans. Lost the element of surprise.
The tension during that delay, I can't even imagine.
Unbearable. Constant calls to the weather office. And the initial forecast for the next couple of weeks, awful. More storms. That was the nightmare scenario. Postponing could mean losing the whole summer, having to remotivate everyone. Disastrous.
And the men stuck on the ships, in the ports.
Just waiting. Agonizing. Sources talk about landing craft just circling endlessly in the harbors like crocodiles in a water hole. Desmond O'Neill, the cameraman, watched the men on board eating, smoking, just dealing with this bitter disappointment, still not knowing exactly where they were going until very late. Canadians praying intensely, Americans trying to keep busy, anything to fight the boredom and anxiety.
But then, a glimmer of hope in the forecast.
Late evening, June 4th. The meteorologists offered a thin chance. A brief window of slightly less awful weather predicted for the 5th and 6th. Just maybe enough.
And Eisenhower had to decide.
One of the biggest decisions of the war. In about 30 minutes that night, weighing all the risks, the narrow window, the potential disaster of further delay, he made the call. The fleet sails. D-Day is June 6, 1944.
And so, before dawn, on June 6th, the assault began. But even before the landings, there were crucial actions.
Absolutely. Allied bombers were hitting targets all across northern and western France, trying to isolate the Normandy battlefield, cut off German reinforcements. This included heavy bombing in lower Normandy itself for 3 days prior. Tragically effective in some ways, but, as the sources note, costing almost 4,000 German and French civilian lives.
That's civilian cost.
Yeah.
There was debate about it at the time, wasn't there, between Eisenhower and Churchill?
There was. Concerns about alienating the French population, but what's striking is the reported reaction from some in the French resistance. A grim acceptance. This is war. People will die. Pragmatism born of occupation.
And de Gaulle. He was kind of sidelined initially.
Deliberately kept out of the loop until the last minute. He formed his provisional government in Algiers on June 3rd. Churchill summons him on the 4th. He flies to Britain. The sources show him really asserting French sovereignty, refusing to just be dictated to by the Allies about running France after liberation. But despite that friction, he agreed to publicly back overlords.
While the main fleet sailed south, there was that diversionary tactic too, right?
Yes, crucial part of fortitude. On the night of June 5th, a flotilla of small ships headed north towards the Pas de Calais, using radar reflectors, jamming equipment, even steam as a smokescreen, trying to make the Germans think that was the main invasion force heading for the shortest crossing.
And Eisenhower, he went to see the troops off personally.
He did. Late afternoon, June 5th, Greenham Common Airfield. He visited the paratroopers of the U.S. 101st Airborne, the guys who'd be first on French soil. Sources describe him walking among them, that famous grin masking, immense tension. He stayed until the very last plane roared off into the night.
Those paratroopers.
Yeah.
They had their own rituals, didn't they, before jumping into that darkness?
Some did. The Pathfinders, the first ones in, some used scarlet war paint, drawing on Native American warrior imagery. Apparently some were actually Iroquois. Others just blackened their faces with charcoal, camouflage, and maybe a bit of psyching themselves up, jumping with insane amounts of gear weapons, parachute, radios. It supposedly took 3 other guys just to shove one fully loaded paratrooper onto the plane.
And the odds.
Grim. Sources state it plainly. A 50% chance of survival. They knew it.
That night, Eisenhower wrote that note.
Yeah.
The one accepting blame if it failed.
Yeah, it tells you everything about the pressure he was under, the uncertainty. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone, taking sole responsibility for potential catastrophe. Powerful stuff.
Then, as dawn broke on the 6th, the big guns opened up.
First, the bombers hitting coastal defenses overnight. Then the naval bombardment. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, miles offshore, maybe 45 miles out, some of them just pounding the Atlantic Wall defenses, trying to soften them up before the troops hit the beaches.
And the landing zones were divided up.
Yep. British and Canadians on the eastern flank, Sword, Juno, Gold Beaches, that's between Ouistreham and Arromanches. Americans on the western flank, Omaha and Utah beaches.
Each with specific jobs to do.
Key objectives. For the British and Canadians, the big one was taking Caen quickly. Vital road junction, flat ground nearby for airfields and tanks. For the Americans further west, push inland fast, cut off the Cotentin Peninsula, and, crucially, capture the deepwater port of Cherbourg. Ideally within a week. They needed that port for supplies.
But despite all that bombing, all that naval gunfire, the German defenses in many places were still shockingly effective.
They were. It's one of the brutal truths of D-Day. A lot of the bombs missed, or the naval shells landed too far inland or didn't penetrate the concrete bunkers. Timings were off with the tide sometimes. So on too many stretches of beach, the German machine guns, the mortars, the artillery, they were ready and waiting when those landing craft ramps went down.
And nowhere more devastatingly than Omaha Beach.
Bloody Omaha. Just a horrific scene. This was a key American beach. You had experienced troops from the Big Red One, but also the relatively green 116th Infantry. The landing craft had to drop them way too far out rough seas, intense German fire keeping the boats back. Men were terribly seasick, crammed in. Then they hit the beach, right into the teeth of those intact defenses. One photographer called it a turkey shoot.
And the tide made it worse.
Came in fast, forced men into deep water under fire. Rommel's beach obstacles, those poles, the metal structures, the mines, they worked exactly as intended here. Tore up landing craft, channeled men into killing zones. They were pinned down, pinned right on the waterline. Sources use phrases like nailed to the spot, couldn't advance, couldn't even reach the wounded easily. One account said it was more like crucified. Strong currents pulling men under, the weight of their gear drowning them. Just chaos and slaughter.
The losses at Omaha were staggering.
Around 3,000 American casualties just on Omaha, just on D-Day. It was so bad the commanders were seriously thinking about calling off the Omaha landing entirely, pulling back, abandoning the guys already trapped there. Robert Capa's famous photos, the few that survived, they give you just a tiny blurred glimpse of that hell.
But thankfully it wasn't Omaha everywhere.
No, crucially, it wasn't. While Omaha was a disaster zone, the other beaches, while still incredibly tough, saw more success. The Germans were still partly confused by the deception, expecting the main blow at Calais. Von Rundstedt's panzers were held too far back initially. So while the Atlantic Wall held at Omaha, it started to crumble elsewhere under the sheer weight of the assault.
And Allied air power was just dominant?
Utterly dominant. Over 10,000 Allied planes flew sorties on D-Day. They pounded German defenses, airfields, roads, bridges, railways, made it incredibly hard for the Germans to move reinforcements towards the beaches. And the French resistance fighters, they played their part too, hitting German units on the move, disrupting communications. Rommel's instinct about needing tanks near the beaches. It was proven right, tragically, for the Germans. Where they did have forces close by, like the 21st Panzer near Calais, they caused real problems.
Let's look at Sword Beach, British sector. Sergeant Ian Grant, the cameraman, landed there.
Right, British 3rd Infantry. Their job, take Ouistreham, push towards Caen. Supposed to take Caen on day 1, very ambitious. Grant filmed the Scotsman of the 45th Commando hitting the beach. His own account talks about it being the real thing. Filming from sea level, feeling seasick from the diesel fumes, the deafening noise. He described a landing craft ramp breaking, men having to jump off a single narrow gangplank burdened with gear, capturing that chaos.
And Desmond O'Neill, the younger cameraman, he was there too.
On Sword, yeah, but even earlier, one of the first ashore. Filmed those initial moments, described it as totally unreal, nothing like the movies. Beach exits clogged immediately. Then his camera jolts, he'd been shot. Thankfully not fatally. Managed a few more shots before being evacuated. Sword was tough going, about 600 British casualties. O'Neill filmed German prisoners being rounded up, that immediate shift in fortune.
And Juno Beach, the Canadian sector.
Their big objective, Carpiquet Airfield near Caen. Sources mention automatic cameras filming the first wave there, capturing the sheer intensity but also small human moments. Cameron filmed the first French house being liberated near Juno, a symbolic victory that cost 100 Canadian lives. Interestingly, they were apparently asked not to film the casualties too graphically, documenting history, but maybe sanitizing it slightly.
But beachheads were established. Progress was made.
Yes. Juno had rough seas for the later waves, cost around 300 Canadian lives, but they got ashore, established their beachhead, started moving inland, met by incredibly emotional French civilians, women overjoyed, some speaking French with Canadian accents perhaps, welcoming the liberators.
Back in Portsmouth, Eisenhower must have been riding an absolute emotional roller coaster.
Oh, absolutely, getting these fragmented reports. Alarming news from Omaha stuck, heavy losses. Then more encouraging messages from Utah, from the British beaches, making progress. Sources say he looked deeply anxious, knew the landings were achieved, but the battle was far from won. Omaha was still touch and go hours after the first waves.
And the medical teams, right there from the start.
Vital. The Americans especially had experienced medical corps personnel landing with the very first waves, ready for immediate triage and treatment right there on the beaches, even treating enemy wounded. Absolutely essential, especially on bloody Omaha, where so many lay rooted for so long.
So by the end of June 6th, despite everything, the cost, the chaos at Omaha.
Late in the day, the beachheads were secure. Maybe not as deep as planned, Cayenne hadn't fallen, but they were established across all 5 sectors. The advance inland had begun. Given the scale, the defenses, the weather, it was deemed a success, a costly success, but the door to Fortress Europe had been kicked open. The battle for Normandy, though, was really just beginning.
Right, getting ashore was one thing. Winning the battle for Normandy over the next couple of months, that was a whole different kind of fight. And the sources point to a significant delay early on, particularly for the British around Caen.
They do. Montgomery, who arrived a couple of days after D-Day, he was famously cautious, liked to build up overwhelming strength before committing. And the sources suggest this caution led to a delay in pushing his armored divisions hard towards Caen immediately after the landings. That initial objective, taking Caen on day 1, was missed, and they struggled to take it quickly afterwards.
And there's some interesting observations in the sources about the mood of the troops then.
Yeah, it suggested that maybe after the sheer terror and intensity of the landings, some British units showed a bit of a lack of bite, a slackening off perhaps? Understandable maybe, exhaustion and relief playing a part. Cameramen filmed soldiers looking quite relaxed, filming French locals, watching prisoners.
Like that footage from Norman Clegg.
Right. On June 8th, he filmed these moments described as appeasement, where German prisoners and wounded seemed to lose their fear. A subtle shift from the kill or be killed mentality of the landing. Tragically, Clegg himself was killed just 5 days later. It highlights the contrast between the fury of the assault and the slower, grinding pace that followed in some sectors.
And the Germans took advantage of that slow pace around Caen.
They did. While the main panzer reserves were still struggling to get there, the German forces already close by reacted fast. 2 armored divisions, including that fanatic 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend division, counterattacked hard between June 7th and 9th. They basically slammed the door shut on the road to Caen, setting up very strong defensive positions just outside the city.
Which made bombing the city itself less useful.
Exactly. The key German defenses weren't always in Caen, but ringing it. So Allied bombing raids on the city, while devastating to civilians and buildings, didn't always hit the main German fighting positions effectively. The Germans held the city center for weeks. Civilians fled.
And the Allied paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. They faced tough times too.
Yeah, huge challenges. Many were dropped inaccurately, miles off target due to darkness and navigation issues. Made it really hard to link up, achieve their objectives. Losses were heavy, maybe half their equipment lost. 1 in 5 men killed or captured pretty quickly. But there was an upside, strangely. Their wide dispersion completely confused the Germans, made them think far more Allied paratroopers had landed than actually had, tying up German forces looking for ghosts. But the cost was high. You see footage of makeshift cemeteries for the airborne dead.
While the British were bogged down near Caen, the Americans ran into their own wall, the Bocage country.
Oh, the Bocage! A landscape totally alien to most GIs. This dense network of high, thick hedgerows on top of earth banks, separating small fields with sunken lanes between them. It was perfect defensive terrain.
A nightmare for attackers.
An absolute nightmare. A few determined Germans with machine guns and anti-tank weapons could hold up whole battalions. Tanks couldn't easily cross the hedgerows, got stuck, or were channeled onto the narrow roads where they were ambushed. The sources call it a huge checkerboard maze.
Costing thousands of American lives.
Thousands. Just trying to advance a few hundred yards, failed attacks, immense frustration. You read accounts of GIs just cursing this goddamn country.
So Americans stuck in the Bocage. British stalled at Caen. Pressure builds. Caen has to fall.
Montgomery finally decides to throw overwhelming force at it. Calls in massive RAF bomber support. Over 2,500 tons of bombs dropped on Caen.
On the city itself, that's immense.
Devastating. 3/4 of the city destroyed, then fierce ground combat. Finally, 115,000 British troops push into the eastern part of the city. Montgomery arrives July 13th. Took over a month to capture part of a city they hoped to get on day 1.
And the bombing, the civilian cost?
Yeah.
Still debated today.
Hugely debated. Was it necessary? Was it effective, given the main German defenses were outside the city? Around 2,000 French civilians died in that bombing. Churchill visited the sector around then, apparently quite agitated by the lack of a breakthrough.
But while Caen was a struggle, the Americans did achieve that other key objective, Cherbourg.
Became absolutely vital, especially after that huge storm in mid-June wrecked the artificial harbors. The American Mulberry at Omaha was basically destroyed. The whole timetable was slipping. They had to get that deep water port at Cherbourg working.
How did the capture go?
U.S. troops surrounded the city, pushed into the suburbs around June 26th. The German commander, LT General von Schlieben, surrendered. Notably, the sources say he surrendered before his men did, breaking his oath to Hitler.
How were the prisoners treated?
The Americans had taken heavy losses, 22,000 casualties since D-Day, just in their sector. So accounts suggest treatment of prisoners could be harsh at times. Interestingly, the prisoners taken at Cherbourg were a mix of very young boys and older men, seen as a sign the German army in the West was scraping the barrel compared to the East.
How many captured?
Around 36,000 German prisoners at Cherbourg, a massive haul. Its capture meant a key piece of the Atlantic Wall had fallen. The footage of captured officers shows some looking haughty, others ashamed.
After Cherbourg falls, Hitler steps in more directly.
Yes, and not necessarily for the better. Von Rundstedt suggested negotiating a truce, so Hitler sacked him, replaced him with von Kluge, who was seen as more loyal, maybe less realistic. Rommel, seeing this inflexibility from Hitler, reportedly became quite dismayed, knew they were just delaying the inevitable disaster.
On the Allied side, Eisenhower's looking for a breakthrough. He puts his faith in Omar Bradley.
Ike really trusted Bradley, liked his calm, methodical, effective style. Bradley had handled the Utah-Omaha landings, took Cherbourg. Eisenhower saw him as the guy who could finally crack the stalemate. especially the bocage puzzle.
And Bradley comes up with Operation Cobra.
That was the plan. Bradley believed they could punch through in the bocage, his idea. He used pinpoint carpet bombing, saturation bombing to just pulverize a narrow section of the German front line. Then pour troops, especially tanks, straight through that gap before the Germans could recover. Fan out towards Brittany and the Seine.
Did it work?
July 25th. Allied bombers unleashed hell on the German lines near the Saint-Laperia Road. Sources say a whole German panzer division caught in the bombing zone was basically wiped out. It created the breach. The American breakout began.
Finally out of the bocage trap.
Exactly. American armored divisions, now equipped with these special Rhino tanks with big metal tusks welded on the front to rip through the hedgerows they poured through the gap, reached Coutances, Avranches, Granville, racing towards Brittany.
And this is when the French forces arrive in force.
Early August, yeah. The 2nd French Armored Division, led by General Leclerc, these are the Free French guys who'd been fighting since 1940. They land at Utah Beach, finally back on French soil, integrated into Patton's Third Army.
Patton. Just the man for exploiting a breakout.
Bradley was counting on him. Patton, the go-getter. There's that colorful quote about Bradley knowing Patton would charge ahead at the first opportunity. He was unleashed.
As the Americans broke out, the Germans tried one last gamble.
Hitler's plan, cooked up far from the front line, a counteroffensive aimed at Mortain, trying to cut off Patton's advancing columns, drive a wedge to the sea, split the Allied forces.
How did that go?
It failed, quickly and decisively smashed by Allied air power. Those rocket-firing Typhoon planes were devastating against tanks. Von Klug, the German commander, knew it was hopeless, wrote as much before committing suicide. That was basically the last gasp for the German army in Normandy.
And that failed Mortain attack set up the final act, the Falaise Pocket.
Exactly. Bradley had sort of let the Germans advance into that Mortain bulge, setting a trap. Then he ordered the pincers to close, Americans driving north from the south, British and Canadians pushing south from the Cannes area, aiming to trap the retreating German 7th Army between Argentan and Falaise.
And trap them they did.
Annihilation. Eisenhower visited the pocket afterwards, called it the biggest bloodbath he'd ever seen, said only Dante could have described it, talked about stepping over dead bodies for hundreds of yards, maybe 5,000, 6,000 Germans killed in the pocket itself, another 30, 40,000 captured.
For those captured, it must have been a relief almost.
Sources suggest exactly that. For many, captivity was a victory, life over death. A lot weren't die-hard Nazis, just conscripts not prepared to die for a lost cause. The German army in Normandy was effectively destroyed in that pocket.
And with the German army smashed, the road to Paris was wide open.
August 19th, word reaches Paris. The Allies are coming fast. The city rises up. Insurrection against the German occupiers. The German commander decides not to fight a street battle for Paris, starts pulling his troops out, heading east. There's real footage of retreating Germans being attacked by resistance fighters.
Like,
ordinary French men and women rising up. Dozens died in those final days before liberation.
but Eisenhower initially didn't want to go straight into Paris.
His military instinct was to bypass it, avoid getting bogged down in urban fighting, surround it, let it fall like a ripe fruit, he apparently said. But de Gaulle shows up at Ike's HQ on August 20th, argues passionately. You have to go into Paris, now.
Why the urgency for de Gaulle?
2 main reasons, according to the sources. 1, prevent a potential bloodbath if pockets of Germans held out or if score settling got out of hand. 2, and crucially for de Gaulle, politics. He needed to assert his authority, establish his provisional government quickly, and importantly, sideline the communist elements in the resistance, who were also very active and might try to seize control.
So Eisenhower agreed.
He yielded to the political logic. Bradley was told to detach Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division, the guys who'd fought well at Falaise, and let them be the first Allied troops into Paris. Let them accept the German surrender.
Must have been an incredible moment when they arrived.
Absolutely unforgettable. After some fierce fighting south of the city, Leclerc's tanks roll up to the gates of Paris, met by ecstatic crowds, tricolor flags everywhere, total jubilation. De Gaulle's gamble paid off. France was symbolically right there, shoulder to shoulder with the victors.
And the politics continued after the entry.
De Gaulle moved fast to cement his position, asked Eisenhower for a public show of support. Ike and Bradley obliged, understanding they needed a stable France as a post-war ally. Eisenhower organized that famous march past of U.S. troops down the Champs-Élysées, partly a victory celebration, partly a signal the fight continued, but also a clear backing of de Gaulle's leadership.
It's been quite a deep dive. Vivid stories, even though so much of the original footage is black and white.
Yeah, but that footage, black and white or not,
Yeah.
it captured the fate of so many individuals caught up in this enormous event, so many anonymous faces in those crowds of soldiers.
And our sources end on that note, don't they? Looking at those faces, asking, who were you? A really powerful reminder of the human story behind the grand strategy.
A moment to remember them, absolutely.
So what does this all really mean? When you pull back from that colossal armada and the incredibly complex, almost unbelievable planning for overlords, through the sheer hell of Omaha Beach, the grinding, awful fight in the bocage, and then that final brutal entrapment at Falaise. The road from June 6th to liberating Paris, well, it was anything but a simple victory parade, was it?
Not at all. We've seen the clashes in strategy, Monty's caution versus Rommel's ideas, that German command split. We've seen something like the weather could nearly derail everything, how critical deception was. And the sources just constantly remind you of the sheer ingenuity of those Mulberry Harbors, alongside the just immense sacrifices. Soldiers from so many nations, many just kids, really.
And it is striking how the narrative keeps bringing you back to those individual stories, doesn't it? The cameramen, the paratroopers' rituals, the mood on the ships, the faces of prisoners. Amongst these millions of people and vast machines, it makes the personal cost incredibly real.
Yeah, and if you connect that to the bigger picture, the success of overlords, even with all the setbacks, the huge cost in Normandy, it fundamentally changed the war. It opened that direct path into Germany from the west, led to the rapid liberation of France, and was absolutely decisive in defeating Nazi Germany. Shapes the world we live in, really.
Which does bring us back to that final question. When you look at the sheer scale of what they face, the uncertainty, the brutality, and you look at the faces, the named leaders, and the countless anonymous soldiers who went forward anyway, what does their story, their experience tell us about, I don't know, the forces that drive history? And maybe just the raw human experience of war itself. What's the thing that stays with you most from digging into this?
Thanks for diving deep with us into this incredible, sobering, and ultimately very human story.